Starts to pay off, because the theory that I'm going to talk about from this point forward, it doesn't really matter if your project's going to focus on Instagram or why you do things on Instagram or anything like that. I think the theory is going to be adaptable for just about every project that could be possibly done. So, key work if you're going to look at self-representation in any form, I think, is Kat Tiedenberg's book, Selfies, Why We Love and Hate Them, which I've put a copy of in a weird format because I could never find the unified book. So I've just put a copy of each of the chapters up in the reading folder, which kind of makes it easier to digest anyway. But if you bought the book, you'd read it in like 2 hours. It's really short and accessible. Why should we study selfies? Well, people like taking and looking at selfies, and this has been proven in numerous empirical studies as well. The content that people like seeing the most and they get most physiological joy out of tends to be self-representations. But people feel judged by negative portrayals, not just of the form of selfies themselves. The selfies are kind of a narcissistic thing to do, but also judged very much on the form of the selfie. That people will feel, that they're not putting themselves across very well, or that, it's, people feel a lot of pressure to present themselves in particular ways. So there's a lot of positive passionate responses to selfies, which make them a very interesting thing to study. So Tiedenberg's book is excellent in this regard. Selfies should be understood as a means of communication. That would be my most important point that we look at, that self-representation is a means of communication. Visual self-representation of whatever form is important. Now, when selfie culture first emerges, really about 10 years ago, a little bit longer before that, but roughly a decade ago, selfie culture became a stick to beat millennials with. I'm not a millennial, you guys aren't millennials, but that group in between you and I was seen as being narcissistic, vain and shallow by the propensity of people to represent themselves in this way. Seen as narcissistic, vain, disconnected from other people, just using representations of themselves as bait for likes and comments on social media, fulfilling a grim feedback loop of self-validation. Basically that means that in wider culture, selfies are seen as something, or self-representation is seen as something low, seen as something base, seen as something which we shouldn't engage with. It's not something that we should be doing. We don't have to subscribe to that. That, in fact, is fundamentally wrong as far as I'm concerned. And in the digital age, self-representation plays an extremely important role, not just in self-validation, which in itself shouldn't be seen all the time as being a negative. Validating yourself is not a bad thing. Getting self-validation or feeling good about yourself, well, it's kind of in the way I've just said it. Feeling good about yourself is good. Feeling bad about yourself all the time, that's something we should be avoiding. These are a way of, and a means of experiencing and expressing yourself. A way of expressing different identities, a way of expressing authentic identities, a way of communicating things about yourself which you feel are important, about building and maintaining relationships. The way that we represent ourselves visually becomes a tool by which we communicate with others, far more than just an idea of millennial narcissism. Now, as you remember the way I finished the lecture last week, narcissism is a really important theme in this module. But that doesn't mean that we have to consider everything through that lens, narcissism. And what I want to argue here is that representing ourselves visually can be a positive thing. Because selfies can be an expressive act, it can be an object, it can be a cultural practice, a gesture, but also tools for reclaiming our identity in particular ways. Now, some people go too far. Selfies can be seen as a highly sort of addictive thing that people do, which have sort of traits of psychopathy in them. And if you are a psychopath, I expect you to be my boss in a couple of years, because that seems to be the defining characteristic of who runs Swansea University, is you have to be a raging psychopath. So I'll suck up to you. But at the same time, you might want to get that seen to, because that's not great. So the manner and the way in which we do this is what I'm saying is important here. To do something obsessively is not great. Is that a Stanley Cup? Superb. I always just get, people have been talking about them and I was like, I've never actually seen one, so that's it. Are selfies good or bad? No. That is the wrong question. Okay? It's like asking, are trainers good or bad? They're neither of those things. This is not a moral judgment. Okay? And we shouldn't make moral judgments about these kind of things. Me. It's not good or bad, but the context, like all things, is all important. Contextually, we can make judgments about whether these things, if you like, are healthy or not to be engaging in. It's how we use them, what we do with them, why we do it is the important stuff. The context is all important. Whose selfies are we talking about? What's on and in them? Why were they shared? What was the purpose underpinning that? If the purpose underpinning taking and sharing a selfie is purely to try and drive up likes and comments so you can monetize your sort of presence on social media, I would argue that that's not necessarily good and bad, it's just a bit foolish. Because actually, there are a very, very small number of people who can manage that. And the vast majority of us will never get to that position. So, we should never think of things in terms of good and bad in this way. What we need to think of is the context in which they're done. What is selfie culture? Well, the basic sociological definition of a culture states that all culture has 5 elements. Symbols, a language, values, norms, and a material artifact of some kind. And all of those things are learned through participation in that culture. So we can look at selfie culture and think, is there a symbolic form? Yes, there is. It's the self-representation in some way. Is there a language underpin it? Do we understand and have nuance in it? I think we do. Are there values to selfies? Yeah, there are acceptable ones and non-acceptable ones. There are norms of taking these things and there are practices of doing them. And are there material artifacts involved? Well, you might think that a digital image is a material artifact, but it operates as such because we look at it as such. We look at it through material things. But there's a whole material sort of architecture around taking selfies as well. How many people own a ring light? You are the only person, Nesta, only 2 of you admitted to it. They're on. They just don't put their answer last week. But good for you. Do you feel it helps?
Yeah.
So selfie culture basically means people's ways of taking, sharing, posting, filtering, liking, and very important that we often forget about, deleting selfies. One of the things we never think about visual culture very often is how we curate it. Images that we've taken in the past, we will get rid of. If that image no longer fits into the story that you're making of your life, get rid of that image, get rid of that part of the story. Edit the story so it's not important. You go through a breakup with somebody, you fucking hate that person now. Of course, we don't have to do that so much these days because thanks to Google in particular, we can now erase people. Has anyone tried to do that thing where you erase somebody from your photo? How'd you find that? Happy with that?
Yeah.
Fuck, I'm in given that my personal life is a concurrent and constant train wreck, I've become really good at using that tool. Because I'm always having to erase people out of it. So I'm shit off as you. If you want lessons in how to erase people, from your images, come talk to me. I know how to do it. Sometimes you're left with a funny arm. Yeah. And we've got norms and values that guide these behaviours. So this is how we should think about visual self-representation. So, selfie is a carrier of multiple meanings collapsed into one entity. The OED definition, I would tell people don't use dictionary definitions, but I've got the Oxford English Dictionary definition here because it was the word of the year in 2013. Photographic object, a self-representational object, and a digital networked object. So selfie has to be these things. Has to be photographic, has to be self-representational, and has to be digitally networked. It has to be something which is shared, or at least has the possibility of being shared. You might not hit the share button, but it is there, it's able to be shared. The most important point out of those 3 is the second one. Self-representational. that does not mean it has to be an image of yourself, or a clear image of yourself. Something which is self-representational. This links to Stuart Hall's ideas here on indexing. But a self-representational object is something which indexes to us in a particular way. So, for example, a lot of people would know that I support Swansea City football. Right? So I might take an image tomorrow night when they're playing Leeds of the outside of the stadium and share that on social media. And that is a self-representational image. It's saying things about me at that point in time which people who I share that with would understand about me. It's representing a particular aspect of me. I'm not in the image, but it still operates as a self-representational object. So it says a taking of oneself, but that can be much more flexible than that sounds. So this kind of imagery has a very long history. You know, going back in the past, people would have portraits taken of themselves. One of the most popular aspects of early photography was going to a photography parlour to have an image taken of yourself. And people would have these really weird setups to take images. Because photographs took a while to develop when they first came out, because of daguerreotypes and all this sort of thing, people would have to be put in braces, like physical metal braces, to be kept still for a period of time, usually up to about 15 minutes. And you weren't allowed to move in that 15 minutes, because the photograph had been taken and was developing. If you moved, it would go blurry. So people had to sit absolutely still for that period of time. Fortunately, photography's got better over the years. But there's a long history of that kind of self-portraiture that goes back, obviously, before the photograph itself as well. People would commission artists to paint images of them and be preserved, and those would be passed down through family lines. And obviously they were a sign of conspicuous consumption in the past as well, because only the wealthy could afford to consume, to hire somebody to paint an image of somebody else. You had to have some money to do that. So self-representation of this kind has been around forever, but now we have the means in which we can all do it instantaneously, very, very cheaply, etc. A nuanced approach appreciates that all three features need to be simultaneously present for a selfie to be present, or for a selfie to be selfie. So it must be a photo, must be intended and legible as a self-representation, doesn't have to be of oneself necessarily, and has to technologically afford easy sharing. It's definitely not an image of the face, so it doesn't have to be, and need not be shared to qualify as a selfie, but could be shared. So rather than just being a photographic object, a self-representational object, or a network object, the selfie is a configuration of all three. Self-representational network photographs, as Tiedemann calls them. How do we make sense of what's going on here? We make it through these ways. What affordances? How are we using the technology to take this image? What discourse and rhetoric does this fit into? What is it saying, and how is that in conversation with how other people represent themselves? What is interaction with it? How are we performing a selfie? A selfie isn't a blank thing. You're always posing, performing it. That performance tells a story. How does it fit into wider culture? Does it stick with the rules, or does it invalidate the rules in some way? What are the social cues being used? What is the social situation around it that's provoking that image? How is it aiming towards virality or visibility or visuality? And how does it comment on visual culture itself? So if you're going to think of talking about how you represent yourself on Instagram, for example, here's a tick list of stuff that you could talk about in your project about how you do that. Self-representation is about how we use signs to attribute meaning to ourselves via whatever it is we have chosen to stand in for ourselves, and that's important. The visual image itself is not us. It is an abstraction. So we are always constructing the visual image to stand in for us. And because of that, we are always involved in an active process of constructing that visual image. Even if we don't think about it, think, oh no, I just took it on the fly, that in itself, that decision is is choosing how this is going to stand in for us. So, self-representation of this kind is always towards others. very important here, we're looking to attribute meaning to ourselves so it can be interpreted by others around us. What we want, again, to go back to Stuart Hall, is what we call a hegemonic or reading of the image. We want people to see that thing and agree with the main messages that are being communicated in it. We want people to understand it, and therefore, if we're communicating something about ourselves, for example, they understand that thing that is being communicated. And while these things are personal, they're culturally informed. We look at what others do, we judge the success of that, and then we take aspects of other people's performance in order to inform our own. Because as Hall says, representations are what index us to others. How we represent ourselves is how we get other people to understand us in a way that we hope is concurrent with how we feel about ourselves. That is important to our psychological well-being. So self-representations index ourselves to others because we identify with them, and this is a very important process. And we are doing this basically more and more in the digital age because we have the means to do it. So self-presentation is the key aspect here. And this is the theory which is the kicker. This is the theory that nearly everyone talks about in their projects and in their critical essays. And it's ironic that this is kind of a selfie, in an age where selfies didn't really exist. So, the presentation of the self is a function of the self. Self-presentation, as an academic concern, is most closely associated with this man, Canadian sociologist Irving Goffman, who wrote a book in 1957 called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, which is a critical text in the history of sociology. Self-presentation means, according to Goffman, everything we do to manage the impressions we make on other people. Everything. And for Goffman, what we do in any given situation is we play a role. We are always in and out of different roles that we learn as we go through life. So for example, on leaving this lecture, you might well go to the shop in Fulham House. Yeah, reasonable enough. Two of us may go there. Yeah? Lana, you might walk in, I might walk in after you. Okay? I'm not stalking Lana, it's just a coincidence. Okay? Now, Lana goes in there and plays the role of customer. She selects the goods and services of the shop and happily goes up to the till to pay, exchange money for goods and services, which is the traditional way of accessing a shop. And you know how to do that, right? Did anyone ever stand there and teach you? Ah. So you learn that role from observing other people successfully negotiating. It's actually, when you break it down, a reasonably complex task. Me, on the other hand, I have a psychological disorder. So I go into the shop and I thieve loads of stuff in there. I quite like them Cadbury's Boost bars. I think they're quite good. Shove them in the back pocket. What else is easy to steal? Chewing gum, always a favourite of mine. Nobody's going to nick you for nicking chewing gum, alright? It's only cheap. So I go in there and rob some chewing and walk out. And the whole time I'm in there, I'm looking pretty shifty, right? But also, I've got like stats card on that. I'm above thieving stuff. So I'm playing a role like, I'm a customer, but, don't want any of this shit. So I'm just going to walk out with loads of stuff in my pockets. And nobody's going to suspect me of that because the people working there have another concept of a role that I have. So they've got multiple roles going on at the same time. Not only am I a shoplifter, but I'm also a lecturer. And the students who are working in the shop are like, oh fuck, we can't do anything about it. Works here. He's not stealing anything, it's ridiculous. It's been going on for 5.5 years, this shit. A lot of good stuff out of that shop. So, because I'm skilled at this, right, I know how to play off the roles against one another. I know what I'm doing, alright? Don't get to my position in life without knowing a few things, alright? So I'm able to leverage roles in a particular way. And we can do this all the time. Because we understand implicitly what those roles mean. how they create social hierarchies, and how we can leverage those social hierarchies. But most importantly, how we can act in accordance with those roles in order to get things done. Now, I always find this deeply ironic because I'm supposed to be a lecturer. As I understand it, other lecturers don't come into lectures and start effing and blinding and calling people twats all the time. But that's their loss, all right? As far as I'm concerned, if they want to do that, then I'm not here to tell them anything different. But they have a role. I have a role. And I have an understanding of that role, and so basically, everything that's going on here is a self-presentation strategy. You're all doing it right now. Some of you are presenting as engaged students. And some of you are engaged. And others of you are not fucking engaged at all. But you're presenting as engaged, and that's impressive acting. I like the way you're going about doing it. The fact that you're not listening and haven't been listening for the last hour and a half is completely irrelevant to the quality of your performance, which is exceptional. Well done. We are always doing these things. This is Goffman's point. We are always learning how to do and engaging in that manner as we see fit. Self-presentation is everything that we do to manage our impression of other people. And we are always engaged in this. How many of you are getting on a bus after this lecture? At some point this evening. Riley, you're getting on a bus. Fab. Karis, you're getting on the bus. Great. Riley, how are you going to sit on the bus?
I don't know, probably on my phone.
Oh, wow. Wow. Why are you going to do that?
To pass the time, because I have to go to Bay campus.
What does that say to the other people on the bus?
I don't know, that I'm not paying attention to them, I'm just kind of zeroed into my...
Managing self-identity, managing self-presentation. Self-presentation technique. Because I put the headphones on, right? I walk around campus with headphones on all the time. Can anyone tell me why?
So people don't talk to you.
Exactly. Because I don't want people stopping me to talk to me. Because I hate people. Okay? Don't take that personally. As individuals, you're fine. But come and talk to me when I'm in a peopling mood. If I've got the headphones on, I'm not in a peopling mood. Okay? Very often the headphones aren't playing anything. But they're a sign, don't fuck with me, people. I'm managing my self-presentation for my own aims, basically. People do this all the time. We do it with the phones on the buses, headphones on the buses. You lock yourself into these bubbles of personal space, right? And you're doing a self-presentation technique, which is communicating to others, this is not a time for you to fuck with me. I am somewhere else right now. That is managing impressions. Now, what I want you to understand is we're doing it. You're all doing it right now. Okay? We can't help but do it. I've got to go and see. You guys know who Sean Reese is, right? Do you guys have you met Sean? Maybe you haven't actually. Sean's like the big boss of everything. Which is kind of weird because we've been friends for 15 years because we were doing our PhDs together. Now she's in charge of everything and I just suck. It kind of pisses me off, right? But I like Sean. I'm not going to make a big deal of it. You'll see. Actually, if you do PRs, the next year you'll get Sean. She's a brilliant teacher. When I go in and see Sean in her office, I'm going to put my top on. I'm going to cover up, right? I'm going to cover all the fucking tattoos up and, clean the language up a little bit. I'm going to go in Sean's office and be like, Sean, what's going on? Because that's not going to happen, right? Because she's my boss. So it's like, oh no, I'm going to play a role at that point. So self-presentation, it's not about overly strategic performances where you're trying to fool people. That's not what Goffman means at all. It's not about trying to make something fake. Instead, it's actions which are emotionally intelligent, which we perform all the time to fit in different situations and persuade people that they're in a shared version of things. And you'll know people who are weird, right? They might have, maybe it's not their fault, maybe they have some kind of disorder or something, but you'll know people who can't do this very well. you know, who can't fit in other things, and they just overtly can't get the tone of the situation right. And that can be quite jarring, because by and large, most people manage this really well. Now, when we think of it, when we think of selfies in terms of self-presentation, they're doing a few different things. They're allowing us to be present in the first instance. If everything that we consume, everything, but one of our primary modes of consumption of the world is digital, then presentation of the self, through the selfie, makes us present in that world. And that's important, that we feel present in some way. Sustaining a presence in the world as it is gives us a personal sense of being part of something wider than us. And we presence ourselves, as Nick Coldry called it, by pushing information about ourselves out there. But, drawing on Anthony Giddens again, I've talked about Giddens a lot in this module so far. Anthony Giddens, in his work Modernity and Self-Identity, says a few very, very important things. I'm not going to, these big slides like this are meant for you to be able to take information for your essays and your projects, okay? I'm going to spend all the time talking about everything on here, but you have the key information at least. The key point that I want to draw on here is self-identity is a person's own reflexive understanding of their biography, and an ongoing project that we are constantly modifying, updating, safeguarding, and so on. For Anthony Giddens, the entire act of self-presentation is about carrying the story of ourselves forward. How we present ourselves at all times is all part of the narrative that we are telling to other people and ourselves about who we are. We are always engaging in a story about who we are as people. Not just to others, but to ourselves. And those stories can be different to one another. The story of ourselves to ourselves can be different to the stories of others. So we are basically a kind of project. Everything that we do is an ongoing project to present in different ways. And that project changes over time. How you present to other people as university students is probably radically different to how you presented prior to that, when before you were at university, when you were in school, for example. You had a different sense of self-presentation and self-presentation strategies accordingly. When you leave university, that will change again. And it will change as you go through life, you know? Sometimes you will care about things more than others. Sometimes you will display certain aspects of your own personality in certain ways, and sometimes you will hide them. But for Giddens, this all relates back to our own self-biography. What story do we understand of ourselves, and how are we telling that story to other people? So, that notion of the biography is really important when we think of the selfie and self-representation, because digital media allows us to store that information and edit, and indeed delete if we feel that's appropriate when we want to change the story of ourselves. It's kind of a self-reflective biography, and our visual self-representations become a very important part of that. Eugenie Ciapara's work here, identity is seen as being in a perpetual beta phase. I really like that term. We're never quite there as a release version of ourselves. We're always in beta testing, always changing little bits of it. And we are, I mean, I like Foucault's words on this as well. We're like a work of art. It's like, I can't think, I'm not like any fucking work of art, but thank you, Michelle, for that thumbs up. So, a person's identity can be found within their capacity to keep a particular narrative going. I think that's a really, really important takeaway of today. We are always keeping a narrative of ourselves going in particular ways. And the tools and the platforms we have for self-representation today are a fundamental part of that narrative drive. And then that's going to bring in all the problems that we're going to have with it as well. So, social networking gives us new ways to curate, present and perform who we are and understand ourselves. And this basically resonates with what Goffman says, that all interactions are performance in which individuals present themselves in a certain light, and identity is basically the outcome of all those enactments that we have. So, according to Katzenberg, networked visual objects like GIFs and memes, etc., but also selfies, allow us to express ourselves with less effort and more nuance. They're a strategically useful form of communication. In the digital age, things that we use to represent ourselves become what's called strategically useful. They tell the story of us in neat, short, and punchy ways, so that we don't have to tell the story ourselves. We can construct on the fly, if you like, very, very quickly, and become extremely skilled in it. And going back to that whole thing where I got you to stand up at the beginning and give everyone a round of applause, that's the point that I'm bringing this back to here. Your skills are in telling those stories, using visual imagery to construct stories for other people to consume, so you keep your own narrative going, but you're doing it in a way that you're not even thinking about doing it. Because you are so skilled at it that it becomes almost a reflex action that you engage with photographic processes in this way. This is why I argue that your generation is the best photographers of all time, because you understand the medium so implicitly that you don't even have to think about what you're doing when you do it, and the aims of what you're doing for. So, let's go back to this idea of performance. When an individual plays a part, he implicitly requests his observers to take seriously the impression that is fostered before them. They're asked to believe that the character they see actually possesses the attribute he appears to possess, that the task he performs will have the consequences that are implicitly claimed for it, and that in general, matters are what they appear to be. Anytime we are self-presenting, we are making the assumption that people will look at it and buy the story. We are there, we are trying to do something, we are saying reflectively, yeah, people are going to buy that. I am going to perform in this way. It's like, come to my office for a tutorial, right, for office hours. You come there in a particular way. I'll come back to this example. But I find it fascinating the way that people walk into my office. It's like, usually like this. And sort of, is it okay if I sit down? Why else do you think the fucking chair is there? Do you know what I mean? There's a sofa there, make yourself at home. I wanted to ask you about this. No. You wanted to be asking about this assignment that you're doing? Really? Couldn't have pieced that together. But it's all part of the role, right? People come in and play a role like, you know, I'm lost, I need your help. And it's like, no, you fucking not. Just get rid of all the bullshit and just ask me the fucking question. Okay, fine, get it. But I understand why people do it, because it's a role that's being played. Now, if anyone was in the second seminar last week, I did something very interesting. I asked Heresia to lie. I asked her to tell me a lie, didn't I? And you couldn't do it, could you? Why do you think that was? In light of this. Well, you couldn't think of anything because I put you on the spot. But also, you're a student in the class. Now, there's a certain amount of truth value that's attached to that. So, I'm saying, like, lie to me. Very weird. We put it in those terms. And she kind of, like, clammed up a little bit. And I was like, okay, that's exactly what I wanted to happen. Thank you. Brilliantly acted. Acted in that way, because you were playing a role at that point in time of an engaged student, knows the answers, right? Knows all the good stuff, has done work, and you know is engaged, and you know knows this stuff, and you know is super into this topic and this life, and is going to do amazing, and is going to get first class degree, and again is probably going to be my boss in a few years, but not because she's a psycho, but because she's just really good at what she does. And all of this stuff is in Keris's script. It's okay. I'm not picking on you because everyone's got a script, right? That's the role that we're playing. What Goffman is saying is basically we come up with these scripts on the fly. That we're always scripting our behaviour in particular ways to make people feel that matters are what they appear to be. Even if it's like, oh, I'm kind of incompetent and I don't know what I'm doing. It's a script. That's why, you know, I know when people come into the office and they're kind of nervous and shuffling about the place and look kind of pathetic, you know, it's a script. There's no need for it. Just don't do it. Just come in and ask fucking questions, fine. I get the script. I've been seeing it for 20 odd years. It's absolutely fine. But I also get why people do it. I understand implicitly why people do it. Goffman uses a metaphor to help us understand what this means. He talks about our front and back stages. So, our front stage is our performance. It's a theoretical, I was going to say theatrical metaphor here. For Goffman, there are two stages. And if anyone's worked in the theatre, or indeed you've just been to a theatre, you might be aware of this. The theatre contains a front stage and a back stage. The front stage is where the stuff happens, where the performance is. The back stage is like where all the production stuff goes on, you know, and you know, people are getting changed into outfits and all this crap, right? So I don't like the theatre because it's full of lines, you know. Goffman says we have these two stages, basically in how we self-present as well. So identity can readily divide in between front and back regions of social interaction. Front regions are the part of the performance witnessed by the spectators. What you're all doing now, it's a front stage performance. You're all performing in a particular way. It might be something you're very comfortable with and it's implicit, but nevertheless, it is a performance. Nobody here at this moment in time is standing on a desk setting fire to shit. That would also be a front stage performance, but it might reveal a part of identity which you don't want others to understand. I'm not saying that people don't want to be doing that. Maybe several of you are arsonists, and if you are, I applaud you. So it's a healthy fucking activity. But we don't necessarily want to do that in front of our peers. Back regions are where performers can relax and step out of character, where there is perhaps a more authentic sense of the self. I use that advisedly because personally I don't think something like an authentic self really resides in us, because we're always beings who are telling stories to ourselves about who we are and what we identify are, and that's always fluid and in movement as well. But this sort of backstage can be inconsistent with the front stage performance, is the proper thing. We can act in a particular way, just like when I go and see Sean in, what, 25, 30 minutes. I will have to act in a particular way in there. And that might not be commensurate with what's going on in the backstage. See what I mean? So the selfie, therefore, or self-representation on digital platforms, is our contemporary front stage. If you want how all this is going to join together, if we take Goffman's metaphor, really what we're talking about in the social media age is we have a series of platforms that act as our front stage. Whereas front stage performance has always been nuanced in terms of the real world, now we have an extra series of ways in which we can perform front stage behaviours, which are no less nuanced. In fact, could be argued they're significantly more nuanced, because you have a whole generation of people who are able to decipher and depict nuanced behaviour via visual communication. So, which is why, again, I don't post images of myself, because I do worry about getting picked apart. It's like, not just because I look like shit, but like, what are you trying to say with this image? It's like, I'm not trying to say anything. People will be like, yeah, you are, because that's what images do. I'm like, I don't get into this. Do you know? So there's kind of a fear there. You know, you guys can do it. So identity is not passive, it's an active process. It's a performance in which people use any number of front regions to present themselves. So in the digital age, one significant one of those perform areas is social media. So if you think about performance in terms of the selfie, think how we take the image, what filter, what angle, what text, who it's shared with, how it's shared, how it's been chosen to be presented over the other images that we've chosen, how many were deleted before this one was chosen for it, all of these things are active parts of the process. That process is the construction of of our front stage performance in the digital age, which is pretty cool. So we've got a theory now, rock and roll. We're also idiots, because we always kind of forget one thing. Even though we know when we construct images for other people to consume that they've been very carefully curated and selected after, we forget that about other people. This is particularly important in influencer culture, I feel. In influencer culture, we will look at images that influencers put out there and think, oh my god, that looks amazing. Say, yeah. Do you know why it looks amazing? Because they've got a crew of fucking people to take that image for them. Do you think Kylie Jenner looks that amazing? No. I'm sure Kylie Jenner is a very attractive woman, right? I'm not fucking shading Kylie Jenner here, but Kylie Jenner has a whole bunch of people working for her to make her look good. Kylie Jenner's never taken a fucking selfie in her life, I can assure you. She's got somebody to do it for her. That's fine. I have no problem with that whatsoever. Good for her. That's, I'm all for her, She's doing it, she's living her best, she's doing it right. My point is this, we often forget that. We forget that the processes that we go through in terms of self-identity and self-presentation are the processes that everyone goes through. But we often don't think of that. And this brings a real problem to us when we think about our own self-presentation, and we're like, oh my god, I look like shit and I put so much effort into it. And it's like, yeah, and so did everyone else. Don't worry about it. But there's a kind of cognitive dissonance that goes on here. The performance of the selfie is really, really important because it communicates so much about us. Now, here is one of the most famous selfies ever taken, I would argue. As you can see, it's from Instagram. It's the old interface of Instagram. It's a very old interface of Instagram. Maybe many of you weren't using Instagram when that interface was a thing. But it hasn't actually changed that much superficially. It's changed quite a bit, I think. Now, I don't want to be horrible. What the fuck am I talking about? Of course I want to be horrible. You met me. That's part of my self-presentation strategies. I'm a horrible person, right? Yeah. So let's be horrible then. What a fucking dickhead. What is the matter with this fucking woman? Here is a classic selfie form. Smiley face. Hair's done nicely. Outfit has been selected. What she perhaps hasn't thought of very closely is the context of the image. So this is taken in Birkenau 1, part of the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland. Roughly speaking, somewhere between 900,000 and 1.2 million people were murdered at this site in the Second World War. And it now stands as a monument. I'm sure some of you may well have been there with the school or something to see as testament to the horrors of man. I don't think you should be taking smiley selfies at Auschwitz-Birkenau. I think that's inappropriate. Unsurprisingly, a lot of other people thought this was inappropriate too. This image went up on Instagram, I think it was like 2013. It became one of the most shared images on Instagram of all time. It became shared across loads of other platforms. This woman obviously had to delete all her accounts instantly and go into hiding afterwards. This was a bad decision. This performance of self-identity was shit beyond belief. This is somebody who didn't understand the rules. Our self-presentation strategies, the problem with this image is, I don't know what she's trying to say. What is it? Is she perpetually happy? So even at the face of the Holocaust, she maintains a sunny disposition, in which case she's fucked up as an individual. But what is she communicating here? It's like, is she happy to be there? No, I've been there. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm a miserable person, but I don't think people generally are happy to be in that place. So there are socially unacceptable ways of presenting ourselves in the digital age, and that has consequences. And this woman, I mean, just think about some sympathy for a while. Her self-biography is fucked. This is like a defining minute in this woman's life. People around her, people who know her will still be, oh, do you remember she took that selfie in Auschwitz? What a twat, like. Do you know what I mean? It's never going away, this. She deleted the account. But you can find, that's on Google image search. You know, you can look up her username. I mean, I don't know, how'd you get through that, like? So how we do the things are really, really important. And who we share them with. I guess if that woman had like a Instagram, and secondary account with like 1 follower on it, and it's private, maybe. I still don't think it's a great. I still don't know what the hell she's trying to say, but maybe that's okay. I don't know. So we always need to think what activities are involved, what things are used, what are the relevant contexts. Again, I'm priming you up here for your assignments, because you can take this for anything that you do on social media as far as I'm concerned. We need to think about how we do these things, selfie practices and their social functions. The importance is on what is being done and the intention of that action and what is being felt. Social media as a communications medium is all about how we present it in the front stage. So we always have to think about how we're doing it. So think of just selfies in this context as self-presentation tools to think with, interactions as a way to feel, and indeed as work. We're doing unpaid labour for these platforms. They are a method of us doing work as well. These things are extremely complex. That's basically what I'm saying. The way that we represent ourselves is incredibly complicated. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'm skipping through stuff. Selfies can be important in developing a sense of ownership and self-efficacy. Is like a positive view of selfies, right? We feel we can be seen, be positively valued, control who we're seen by. At the core, and this doesn't necessarily relate to selfies as a whole, but perhaps wider how we do self-presentation on social media, what we need to think about is how we empower ourselves through the way we use social media. Are our strategies for presenting ourselves empowering or disempowering? And if we don't feel empowered as people, be able to express ourselves authentically in the ways that we want to be in control of our narratives, then we need to really have a look at what we're doing with social media. Why? Because it's clear to me that actually we can use social media in a way which becomes an empowerment tool. But most of us choose not to do it. And focus on that word. Choose not to do it. There is a choice at play here. We can choose to use it in some ways, or we can choose to use it in others. We're not being forced. We might be following norms and cultural norms and so on, but they are just that. They're just cultural norms. We can choose to use it in the ways that we want to use it. But the vast majority of people don't do that. They choose instead to use social media in a way that presents themselves in an extremely formulaic and, I would say, algorithmically sorted way of doing things, where we just copy what the algorithmically popular ways of doing things are. That's much more problematic, because that means our self-presentation strategies are dominated by the platforms rather than we're using the platforms to self-present, which is how it should be. Alright, see you tomorrow.